We live in a world of complex dynamics. Countless generations have strived for justice and retribution, but mostly a common understanding. We are similar in many ways, yet in many ways like competition. From the surface, it all seems like business as usual, but looking closely, the reality isn't quite what should be deemed usual. There is something more than meets the eye: contempt, strife, malice. Violence begets violence, thus creating a cycle of hatred and a culture of indifference among humans. This is true from what we see on the surface. But what lurks beneath the surface? History has proven itself from time to time that it has a strange way of repeating itself. Even though it provides us with enough information to learn from our own mistakes, somehow it also teaches us on how we keep repeating them. The last several years have seen an alarming increase in the number of violent behavioral patterns. The victims of these patterns are primarily women and children. But one can't help but wonder what the cause and motive behind these attacks is.
A scruffy Aubrey Manaka made his way into a packed court this morning. Today was his first appearance in connection with the murder of Precious Ramaburana.
Thou shalt not kill, a moral imperative included in one of the 10 commandments in the Torah. The first act of violence occurs in the book of Genesis, Cain and Abel. But the violence doesn't end there. While we won't focus on the acts perpetrated throughout the countless generations, we'll attempt to answer the question, why? Why do we give in to our violent nature? And why is our generation inclined to so many violent attributes? Perhaps we need to trace the steps back to a time when the statistics were just a fog in the skies. A time when men traveled from rural villages and townships of South Africa to work in the more developed metropolitan areas, mainly cities. The most common work considered to be decent was arguably mining. But the apartheid system made sure to segregate people according to their genders, racial groups, and cultures, particularly black men. They were forced to recognize themselves as the lesser of their counterparts, even by mere children of their employers.
Yes, boss.
Yes, sir.
Yes, boss.
History has reckoned that apartheid was no doubt inherently a white supremacist system. The regulations forced men to be absent from their families for lengthy periods of time. In some cases, wives were not allowed to visit their husbands, thus fostering a thread of absenteeism in the family unit. A common thread across the racial divide was that men were subjected to a lot of verbal and physical abuse. This without a doubt produced a lot of repressed emotions for the men who had to endure and deal with their ongoing psychological trauma of humiliation and emasculation in front of their wives, their children, and their society. Likewise, teachers in front of their students, and the list goes on. This phenomena was not only experienced by Africans in Africa, but also by black people universally who were enslaved and had to continue to undergo a cyclical vacuum of slavery through convict leasing, disenfranchisement, lynchings, Jim Crow, and mass incarcerations. People have echoed sentiments of being wary on blaming modern-day social issues on the past systems like apartheid and slavery. So unless we actually come up with a solution, then the noise about the supposed cause of the problem will never cease. Therefore, what is firstly the problem?
I have great respect for mothers who raise children on their own, be that is by separation or death. However, I can't imagine that there has ever been a single mother who ever thought, this is nice. It's what I've always wanted.
According to attorney Marilyn York, in a TEDx video presentation, these were her findings.
They're the rule. My fourth lesson about fatherhood came from the data. According to the Center for Disease Control, children from fatherless homes account for 90% of all homeless and runaway kids, 71% of high school dropouts, and 63% of youth suicides.
I highly recommend that you watch that video. The link is in the description. Now, just because a fact might not coincide with one's circumstances, doesn't necessarily mean that the fact is irrelevant.
This isn't just an African trend, but a global one. According to research conducted by the Human Sciences Research Council and the South African Race Relations Institute, more than 40% of South African mothers are single parents, and 60% of South African children have absent fathers.
What happens when any expression of masculinity is discouraged and labeled as undesirable and toxic? Now, there's been a strange set to separate men and women through the divide by pitting them against each other. Single mothers are incentivized through welfare programs and also celebrated. The legal system automatically favors mothers by default. This is why fathers are typically perceived as an unnecessary factor in the well-being of a child. Whether the child was born from a slave master circumstance or a failed relationship, it makes no difference. Oftentimes, this is mistaken as a competition or a replacement mechanism. The presence of a father is to foster the kinds of values that only a male figure can. If they don't get it from home, they'll get it from somewhere. But if they do get it from home, what does it look like?
A man who was beaten, insulted, spat on, and abused to a point where he urinated on himself in front of his children. A man whose dignity is lost due to a system that enforced a culture of abandonment and emotional suppression. When is a man allowed to feel angry and express himself when he couldn't take it out onto his oppressors? Thus the journey and rise of the statistics began.
I will say this. African cultures may have their own flaws in the exploitation and subjugation of women's roles in society, but they did get something right. A woman was always a figure that represented honor. Physical violence towards women and children was rare, almost unheard of, because young children always respected their elders, and both men and women honored their roles within that cultural system. So the domestic abuse seemed to have begun when the violation of dignity was domesticated.
Dawning the beginning of gender-based violence. Violence begets violence, thus creating a cycle of hatred and a culture of indifference among humans. The emotional psychological development of a child will always be deprived through a cyclical repression of emotions. Today, men from various backgrounds are speaking up on the challenges they face from growing up without a father and women abuse. People like Dennis Rodman and rapper Lecrae.
You know, there was this big response to all of the stuff that we were seeing in our environment. The murder, the mayhem, the prison, the death, the destruction. And rappers, you know, were speaking a language that we could relate to. I grew up, you know, feeling like I was being raised by Lil Wayne, by Tupac, by, you know, Jay-Z. And in order to understand who I was as a man, I had to construct my own warped sense of masculinity, because hip-hop was the language of a generation of men without fathers.
You know, I was a very good kid when I was young. And once I became to the age of 16 to 18, 19, 20, I could care less what I did to my mother. And my mother worked 3 jobs. And she kicked me out the house and said, you have to leave here because I can't take you anymore. And I resented her for a long time. And it's hard for me to even say this, because my mother rarely ever hugged me or hugged my siblings. She didn't know how.
So I'm finding my role models in drug dealers and gang members, piecing together what masculinity looks like. I mean, truthfully, in order to wear the badge of authentic masculinity, you had to be associated in some kind of way with this wayward lifestyle.
I'd like to set the record straight just for the time being, and maybe hopefully that in the future that I can actually try to be somewhat of a good individual and a good father to my kids.
The reality of the number of homicides relating to women grew to a staggering, alarming number over the last decade. This phenomena gave birth to a word coined femicide.
It is typically difficult to define what femicide is for a couple of reasons. The UN agency says that the conventional understanding conveys the idea that hate crimes against women are perpetrated by men simply because of the gender roles assigned to women. Another one is a similar definition used by States SA, the intentional killing of females because they are females. However, it's quite difficult to label what exactly is femicide due to the lack of information surrounding the circumstances of the murders. The SAPS provides the stats in numbers, but the investigations say little to nothing. So with that said, however one chooses to define the term, we can all agree on this. Violence of any kind towards any human being, in this particular case, women, is uncalled for and an injustice to humanity.
Throughout history, there have been three generational theories of the etiology of mental illness: supernatural, somatogenic, and psychogenic. It was believed that drilling holes in the skull could cure mental disorders. Supernatural theories have always attributed mental illness to possession by evil or demonic spirits, displeasure of the gods, eclipses, planetary gravitation, curses, and sin.
I'm sure a lot of us, especially Africans, have been exposed to this phenomena in the form of witchcraft. If the person is schizophrenic, seems bewitched. If they have Tourette syndrome, they look bewitched. If they're bipolar, maybe weird, but still bewitched. But what if the person is violent? What do we say about that? Back when I was in high school, I came across a subject around people with monoamine oxidase A, or controversially called the warrior gene. It's a gene that has been found to be a contributing factor in aggression and helps create a behavior that can lead to outrageous levels of aggression and violence. But having the gene alone isn't enough of a predictor that it leads to a violent personality. There has to be a link to a personal history of trauma, child abuse, sexual assault as a child, things that were related to severe parental abuse, neglect, absence, illness, drug abuse, alcoholism in the family when we're young.
A society without a proper diagnosis of human behavior will only result in a society living under a misconceived notion of violent behavioral patterns and their cause. Perhaps a psychological approach may shed some light into some of these behaviors, particularly relationship behaviors.
If you find yourself dating a sociopath or a psychopath, is there any coping, or you just got to get out?
You're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
That could actually be a very dangerous relationship.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. In fact, even with the narcissistic piece, I've done research and work in the area of domestic violence, or what's also called intimate partner violence. Most people who perpetrate domestic violence are either narcissistic or psychopathic, and so there's a danger there. In other words, they will dispose of you if you get in their way. Psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists make great chameleons. They're definitely able to change the situation to get what they want. And psychopaths in particular and sociopaths they view the world as an instrument to fulfill their desires.
It's neither witchcraft or demonic spirits. It's just a mental health dilemma. Look, I'm not saying every situation has to do with a mental disorder, because there has to either be a prognosis and a diagnosis to actually prove that. But I can guarantee you that when you live in a society that doesn't care about what's going on with its people, or fails to put the proper resources to facilitate a necessary healing process, then you're bound to see chaos. To make matters worse, not everyone can actually afford those kinds of resources.
There are internal battles going on inside people that have either been unknown or ignored. The red flags are filled with triggers that can bring back memories of the trauma accompanied by intense emotional and physical reactions. It's a cycle of repression framed within fragments of our social issues.
While we definitely have seen and addressed the symptoms, we haven't been talking about the cause. I've always felt that we have a culture of violence that hasn't been addressed from its core. People who have either suffered abuse or mental disorders have been crying for help. Somebody has to start listening. We don't just see this phenomena within the community alone, but also in law enforcement. And remember, law enforcement is made up of people who are part of these communities. BBC covered a story of a serial rapist in Deepsnoot. If you watch the video and listen to these words and language, when he speaks, you think he's possessed by demons.
How many men have you taken them by force and sleep with them?
Maybe 21, 24.
After all these people, 24 of them that you have mentioned, did you use protection?
No, I didn't use the protections. I know I'm HIV, so I want to spread that HIV. I feel good because I can't die alone.
That's why you're spreading, and it makes you feel good.
Yes.
What would my old friend, David's father, think of what his son has become? I could never have foreseen this man I knew as a child becoming a serial rapist.
Have you been sexually abused?
14 to 15 years that time. The police, they're starting to treat me like a wife, then they sex with me.
You were sodomized, so you learned it from there, then you took it with you. You started doing it outside.
Yes.
You still think he's just a simple, heartless, and evil incarnate? Truth is, he's in fact just another victim who got caught up in a perpetual cycle of violence. That's creating a strand of confusion, anger, frustration, and a need to express it. What has been suppressed quenches to oppress. Not only did the culture of separation of their family unit traumatize the men, this infected an entire generation of young boys and girls. They've been growing up in a community that has taught them that manhood is undervaluing and devaluing a womanhood they've grown up identifying as mom. But who is she to their absent fathers? How do they relate that experience to the girls they pursue in their own personal relationships? Before anyone is somebody's boyfriend or husband, he was a child of somebody. These people are members of our society. But whose society do they actually belong to? Or maybe the better question is, who is society? As much as we love to demonize people and make them outcasts who aren't part of our society, the reality is they are our neighbors, relatives, friends, colleagues, classmates, and of course, church members who may be seriously reaching out for help.
Why fight for a person who has taken a life?
We'll see what the governor says.
When I was 16, I did a horrible thing. I do pray that you show me mercy and that you give me a second chance.
The story of Cyntoria Brown is a social dilemma I could recognize from a mile. She came from a marginalized community and a family with a history of mental illnesses. She had social challenges at school, ran away from home, got exploited into prostitution, and involved in a killing of a man. In the end, she ended up in prison. How is this linked together?
Alcoholism was a major part of the marginalized communities and is still the case today. I want you to pay close attention to this. One of the most underrated causes of the problem child stigma is fetal alcohol syndrome. The full impact of FASD in South Africa is immeasurable. It's estimated that at least 28% in specific communities may have FASD. If undetected and untreated, many individuals develop secondary disabilities with consequences of risky behavior and conflict with the law. We can treat the disease or else deal with its curse. In Cyntoria's story, her mother drank during her pregnancy, which is said to have exposed her to FASD. But there's many more young people like her in marginalized and vulnerable communities who can't afford the legal resources, the protection or medical facilities. Let alone, we don't know what kinds of people we're dealing with. This next example is closer to home for me, as this is where I come from. A video of a young woman from Venda in Limpopo circulated social media, it depicts her giving her child alcohol and what seemed like cigarettes. Now, is there a possibility that the child may have FASD? Probably. But I want you to keep this in mind. The boy will grow up with questions of resentment for why he never grew up with a present, responsible mother and father. The cycle continues. Now, I've presented my case a lot so far, and if you made it into this video up to this far, I just need you to understand that I take this subject very seriously. I have sisters and I have women in my life that I love and care for very much, so I wouldn't talk about this unless I felt like it was important, or if I didn't have a perspective to offer that I know can help people out there. Also, I wouldn't give out information unless I felt like it was accurate either. I always say to people, the reason I started the Jesus culture is to have conversations that represent who Jesus means to humanity, not exclusively to Christians or to non-believers for that matter, just humanity. This is extremely important as this channel is dedicated to His significance to our attachment to relationship with God and our detachment from religion and cultural obligation. Now, I have to address this criminal activity that some like to associate the Bible with the subjugation of women to men. One of the most famous of these is wives submit to husbands. Now let's break this down, Jesus culture style. The focus point here is two words, head and subjection. Now, the head represents direction. The entire passage is extremely practical, so let's tackle this likewise. When you feel hungry, the mind knows what the body needs, so it knows it needs to eat in order to nourish the body. So they both rely on each other. That's logical. It's important to note that the word kefali is difficult to translate into a Western-centric understanding as it's used metaphorically. So we can't use it literally because it really wouldn't make sense. Literally, both the husband and the wife have a head. So why would the husband need to be the head of somebody with the head of their own? Doesn't make sense. Now, the second word is subjection, hypotazominoi. I don't know why there seems to always be a focus on the woman, because both the husband and the wife are reminded or advised to submit to each other. Now, there's a word for that. It's compromise. Subjecting yourself to somebody is a way of compromising. Now, anybody in a relationship knows that it's part of the game when you're in the game. A direct definition, hypotazo, to yield to one's admonition or advice. So, head doesn't just represent authority, but dependency. The whole body depends on itself. Women need men and men need women. Oh yeah. But the real emphasis wasn't about marital responsibilities or gender roles, but on how God compromised by sacrificing His Son to save mankind. Grace. In turn, all we need to do is to compromise for His glory. Thus, as you subject yourselves to Christ. In verse 28, so husbands must love their wives as they love their own bodies. A man who loves his wife loves himself. This isn't about hierarchy, but anarchy of the self. Hence, verse 21, under each other's authority out of respect for Christ. Verse 29, no one ever hated his own body. Instead, he feeds and takes care of it, as Christ takes care of the church. The lesson here is in recognizing that two entities may be seemingly separate, but they are ultimately one in purpose. See, Jesus often spoke about oneness to emphasize the dependency we ought to have on God, not just with His own identity as the Son, but with all of us as God's children. Also observe Genesis chapter 2, verse 19 to 24. And this is important because this is where God created man and woman. Woman was formed from part of what was man, two separate entities that came from one unit, but both from one source. By default, men have a protective and a destructive nature altogether. It's either there's chaos or order. The Bible has been subject to a lot of ridicule on the basis of tradition and the transcendence of culture. God's mission has always been to free people from people. People's mission has always been to keep people dependent on people. It's important to understand the full context of the book rather than isolating some statements and fragments from the rest of the message. The entire chapter of Ephesians 5 is warning people from societal influences of evil. The Ephesians were within a community that had influential idol worshipping. The temple of Artemis, or Artemisian, also known less precisely as the temple of Diana, the Cretan lady of Ephesus, the light bearer. Crete was also a place that Paul was familiar with by reputation, where he left Titus in his evangelistic ministry. Now, Cretans were known to be habitually deceptive, so much so that there was a phrase coined after them in the ancient days: to lie as a Cretan. This is true in the letters addressed in Titus chapter 1 verse 11 to 13, if you observe that. In verses 8 to 14, he warns them about the darkness and deception of the world, but reckons the true light, which is from God, leads to righteous living. In short, if you study the chapter again bearing all this in mind, you will have a much clearer understanding. If anything, Jesus championed the subversion of religious subjugation and male-dominated clergies. The Samaritan woman was rejected, but he said she's accepted. The adulterous woman, condemned, but he said she's forgiven. The poverty-stricken widow, poor, but he said she's richer. Not once did he indicate that any of them needed to depend or place their faith on a male figure of any clergy in order to be saved. You see, by acknowledging the freedom giver from the freedom taker, they were free, hence to experience freedom in Christ.
As prescribed in the previous chapter of Ephesians chapter 4, the truth is in Jesus, hence to be cultured in Christ. But as a society, we have a long way to work for our freedom. So I motion for therapy. South African people have a normalized stress culture, and government needs to, at some point, intervene with some actual tactical and practical approaches to regulate human behavior. Incentivize therapy. I motion for that. Public accountability. We need to stop looking at who to blame while being part of the problem and start diagnosing ourselves. Filmmakers, entertainers, broadcasters. It starts with you too. When we share videos on social media of teenagers and sexual content without understanding the context and its consequences, that's part of the problem. We are not only commoditizing sex, but we are devaluing the person being shared in the videos. A predator who preys on women is exactly just that. They are someone with an intent on committing criminal activity. That needs to be recognized for that and nothing more. We need to stop making it a men versus women issue. Because it's not. I repeat, it's not a men versus women issue. Nobody wins in that argument because there's nothing to win. Pitting people against each other isn't going to get us the results that we need. How do I know that? It never has. This is simply a human issue. Gender-based violence is a mere fragment of an attack on humanity that's been happening since the dawn of time. Recycled, repackaged, rebranded, repainted, and reused under different circumstances. Where there's an attack, there are casualties. Where there are casualties, there's victims. And lastly, the two-way stream. Not every instance of relationship conflicts is a subject of gender-based violence and female victimhood. Let's diagnose and recognize the problem on both sides so we don't do a disservice to actual victims. Let's name things for what they are and start calling things by their names. I've got a saying about this. There's no amount of therapy that can solve anyone's problems, but just the admission and realization that one needs therapy can work miracles. We all need grace, but mostly each other. I close my case.